In 1937, the Chinese city of Nanking fell to imperial forces. As the empire extended its grip over Asia, the army ran amok. "300,000 civilians were killed. Up to 80,000 women were raped. In grotesque scenes of torture, some prisoners were hung by their tongues from meat hooks. This was imperialism at its very worst. But of course it was carried out not by British imperial forces, but by the Japanese. The rape of Nanking revealed the true face of the leading alternative to British rule in the 1930s, in all its hideousness. The downfall of the British Empire is usually attributed to nationalist movements. We think of Gandhi in India, or Sinn Féin in Ireland. We're used to being told the empire was the bad guy. The so-called freedom fighters were the heroes. But in truth, British rule wasn't overthrown as punishment for wickedness. On the contrary, in the 20th century, the British Empire would justify its existence by coming to the rescue of civilization. It would fight, and fight again, against far nastier rival empires. What really killed off the British Empire was the staggering cost of doing the right thing. The effort left it bankrupt, owing billions of dollars. And that was why the heir to Britain's global power would be its most successful former colony.
Tonight, the United States of America makes the following demands.
This is the traditional image of the First World War. The storm of steel on the Somme, the muddy hell of Flanders. We think of it as a European conflict, with both sides quite evenly matched. In truth, it was a global imperial war. The main contenders were an aging and complacent British Empire and the young and restless German Reich. Conscious of their vulnerability in the War of Two Fronts in Europe, the Germans set out to globalize the conflict, to distract Britain by undermining her position in Asia. It was the Germans who first spoke of the war as Der Weltkrieg, the World War. And the fulcrum of this war was not in Flanders, but in the Middle East, the gateway to British India. In 1914, Istanbul, known then as Constantinople, was a hotbed of imperial intrigue. It was the heart of the Ottoman Empire that centered on Turkey and stretched from the Balkans to Baghdad. This former superpower was now dismissed as the sick man among the great powers, increasingly dependent on its ally Germany for military and economic aid. But the Ottomans still had one great strategic asset. Down there is the Bosphorus, the narrow channel linking the Mediterranean to the Black Sea and dividing Europe from Asia. In the age of naval power, this was one of the world's great strategic bottlenecks. And in the First World War, it was the key to supplying the Russian war effort against Germany. Turkey could menace that vital supply line and also Britain's imperial communications through the Middle East to India. As an Islamic empire, Turkey posed a further threat to British India. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II urged his Turkish ally to unleash a jihad, a holy war, against British power.
Our consuls in Turkey must fire the whole Mohammedan world to fierce rebellion against this hated, lying, conscienceless nation of shopkeepers. For if we are to bleed to death, England shall at least lose India.
The Turkish Sultan duly declared a jihad against Britain. Given that nearly half of the world's Muslims were ruled by Britain or her allies, this could have been a masterstroke of German strategy. But Britain's answer to the challenge of world war was to mobilize her imperial forces as never before. It's often said that the best fighting men of the First World War came from the Empire's furthest flung outposts. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZACs for short, would make a vital contribution to the war effort. Most famously, in the Middle East, at Gallipoli. The aim here was a bold frontal assault on Germany's ally, Turkey. The plan was to sail into the Black Sea Straits, land at Gallipoli, march on Constantinople 100 miles to the northeast, and secure the strategically crucial Bosphorus. At dawn, on the 25th of April 1915, the Anzacs came ashore down there at Anzac Cove. They were actually about a mile north of where they should have been, probably because of strong currents. But the Turks were very quickly on the scene, and soon the beach was coming under a hail of rifle fire and shrapnel. By the end of the first day, 500 Anzacs were dead and 2,500 were casualties. Among the Australian infantrymen was Sam Weingott from Sydney, son of a Jewish clothes manufacturer who had fled Russian persecution to make a new life in the British Empire.
Wednesday, 5th of May. Had a merry time with the enemy and fired close on 250 shots myself. Enemy do heavy damage with shrapnel, and I narrowly missed getting hit with a cap of a shell. Enemy keep up heavy gunfire, and the aim is very accurate. Mate of mine shot through the heart whilst asleep. Shell explodes in our trench, killing Captain Hill. Dead bodies outside the trench begin to smell. Terrible sights. Many lose their nerves. 29th of May. Tremendous bombardment by the enemy guns. One shell burst in my face, and although unwounded, was knocked out for a few minutes.
My rifle was twisted beyond recognition. That was one of Sam's last entries. On the 1st of June, in recognition of his bravery, he was promoted to Lance Corporal. On the 5th of June, he was shot in the stomach. He died on a hospital ship later that day. Despite repeated attempts to break out, the Anzacs simply couldn't overcome dogged Turkish defence of the high ground. There seemed no alternative but to evacuate the Allied troops. The legend of Gallipoli is of heroic Anzacs led to their deaths by effete and incompetent POM officers. It's a caricature, though it has a grain of truth. The reality was that the British had taken on what they thought was a defunct Oriental empire and lost. The Turks had been well schooled by their German allies and were much quicker to learn the new techniques of trench warfare. their morale was also good, a combination of nationalism and religious fervour. Just as in the Boer War, the British had fatally underestimated the enemy. The ill-starred campaign had cost more than 250,000 Allied casualties. But the German-Ottoman stranglehold on the Bosphorus remained. And with it, the threat to India. It was time for Plan B. The Kaiser had stirred up a jihad. The British now answered it by summoning a new and potent force from the desert: Arab nationalism. This daring new strategy was the brainchild of T.E. Lawrence, an eccentric Oxford historian with a passion for the exotic. T.E. Lawrence was an extraordinary bundle of contradictions, the illegitimate son of an Irish peer who loved dressing up in Arab clothing. He was a brilliant archaeologist, but also a fierce guerrilla fighter. He was a spy who loved fame and then ran away from it when it came. The romantic war hero was someone who admitted to having been buggered by his Turkish captors. He was, in every sense, a queer hero. For centuries, the Arabs had resented Turkish rule. Lawrence's plan was to turn their discontent into open rebellion. The Arabs had to feel they were fighting for their own freedom, he argued, not for the privilege of being ruled by the British. The appeal to Arab nationalism would trump the German-backed jihad. Lawrence and the Arabs were soon probing Turkish defences in Palestine, and in December 1917, Jerusalem fell to the British. After 3 long years of military reverses, here at last was a proper victory with all the trimmings: cavalry charges, fleeing Orientals, and a dashing young hero in the vanguard. By the autumn of 1918, it was clear that the German gamble on global war had failed. Even on the Western Front, British imperial might finally triumphed. At the peace conference at Versailles, it looked like just another version of the familiar old story. To the victor, the spoils. Despite Lawrence's wartime promises to the Arabs, much of the Middle East, including Palestine, became British mandates, colonies in all but name. German territories in Africa were transferred to British rule. A chunk of New Guinea was handed over to Australia. Now even Britain's colonies had colonies. The Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, dryly remarked that he'd like to hear some arguments against Britain's annexing the whole world. Yet there was an illusory quality to this imperial high tide. True, the empire had never been bigger, but nor had the costs of victory, which wholly dwarfed the economic value of the new territories. Before 1914, the benefits of empire had seemed to most people to outweigh the costs. After the war, the costs suddenly and inescapably outweighed the benefits. Britain had won the First World War, but with peace came doubt. The exorbitant cost of victory left many questioning the whole point of ruling the world. So in 1924, in the drab London suburb of Wembley, the government staged a vast exhibition to celebrate the imperial achievement. It was time for a collective pat on the back. Visitors could gawp at reenactments of imperial victories. See the Zulus vanquished all over again. But there were problems with this morale-boosting extravaganza. Financially, the exhibition was the Millennium Dome of its day, running up a huge loss of £1.5 million. Just as importantly, and again like the Millennium Dome, the exhibition became something of a national joke. P.G. Wodehouse had his most famous character, Bertie Wooster, pop in, but he quickly tired of Wembley's worthy attractions.
By the time we'd tottered out of the Gold Coast and were working towards the Palace of Machinery, everything pointed to my shortly executing a quiet sneak in the direction of the rather jolly Planters Bar in the West Indian section.
Before the 1920s, the British had been remarkably good at taking their empire seriously, and that in itself was an important source of imperial strength. Yet by the time of Wembley, it seemed harder to play the role of global policeman with a straight face. The crisis of confidence had its roots in the crippling price Britain had paid for victory. Apart from the huge loss of human life, more than 1 million imperial servicemen dead, the war increased the national debt tenfold. To make matters worse, Britain's new territories cost substantially more than they brought in. In 1921, running Iraq costs more than the total UK health budget. With slow growth and high unemployment at home, the British government simply didn't have the cash to run and defend the even bigger slice of the world they now owned, and certainly not to fight another world war. The policy of appeasement was born. Under pressure from voters to attend to domestic problems, the politicians first neglected and then forgot about imperial defence. An ingenious new rule was devised. There wouldn't be another major war for at least 10 years. Each year the rule was renewed. Each year the spending was postponed. They got away with it for a while, for at this stage the principal threats to the empire seemed to come not from foreign powers, but from within. In 1916, the Irish Republican Brotherhood secured their places in the Hall of Fame of Irish nationalism by staging the abortive Easter Rising against British rule. In the immediate aftermath of the war, ex-soldiers were recruited into the notorious Black and Tans in an effort to stamp out republicanism. But soon, the Empire's will to fight had gone. A peace deal was cobbled together, partitioning Ireland between a mainly Protestant north and a Catholic south, which would ultimately become an independent republic. Time and again, this was the sorry pattern that would repeat itself throughout the interwar period. A minor outbreak of dissent, a sharp military response, but then a complete collapse of British self-confidence, hand-wringing, second thoughts, a messy concession, another concession. By allowing their very first colony to be split in two, the British had sent a fateful signal to the rest of the empire. Though we hear less about it, India had made an even bigger contribution to the imperial war than Australia. In 1914, around a third of British forces on the Western Front had been made up of rather bewildered sepoys. Over 60,000 who were killed in action are commemorated at the Great India Arch in New Delhi. In return for their sacrifice, the British now held out the promise of home rule for India. But to the more radical members of the Indian National Congress, the pace of reform seemed intolerably slow. By
By the end of the First World War, even the recently created Legislative Assembly in Delhi was being sidelined. The British decided to continue their wartime restrictions on political freedom. It seemed to confirm that the promises of Home Rule were empty.
The British had plenty of experience at dealing with violent protest in India, but the diminutive Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the Mahatma to his followers, that seditious fakir to Churchill, was something new, a modern-day holy man. Gandhi urged Indians to harness what he called satyagraha, which roughly translates as soul force. The idea was to make protest non-violent, passive, and yet the British still smelt a rat. To them, Gandhi's idea of a Hartal, a national day of self-purification, sounded suspiciously like a general strike. They resolved to meet soul force with fist force.
One British commander personally attempted to stop what he saw as a rerun of the Indian Mutiny. The irascible, chain-smoking Brigadier General Rex Dyer was not a man noted for subtlety. As a young officer, he was said to be happiest when crawling over a Burmese stockade with a revolver in his mouth. When, amid demonstrations in Amritsar, a female British missionary was attacked, Dyer was incensed. He ordered any Indian entering the street where the attack occurred to crawl on his stomach. And when, despite a ban on public meetings, a crowd of 20,000 gathered, Dyer ordered his Gurkha troops to open fire without warning. 379 demonstrators were killed, more than 1,500 wounded. Many of Dyer's fellow army officers in India celebrated him as a hero who'd saved the Raj from anarchy. But at home, there was horror. In Parliament, even Winston Churchill, no friend of Indian nationalism, denounced the massacre as the most frightful of all spectacles, the strength of civilization without its mercy. Dyer was forced out of the army.
Amritsar was India's Easter Rising, creating martyrs on one side and, perhaps more importantly, a crisis of self-confidence on the other.
The ruthless determination to kill for empire, which had once made heroes of the likes of Clive and Kitchener, had gone. In the 1920s and 1930s, many educated Britons lost their belief in empire, as surely as they lost their faith in God. The New Zealand-born cartoonist David Lowe ridiculed the old imperial ethos in his celebrated caricature, Colonel Blimp. Fat, pompous and irrelevant, Blimp personified all that was stuffy and silly about the empire. Ironically, amid all this interwar anxiety, the Empire's staunchest fan was not British, but Austrian.
The British have learned the art of being masters. However miserably the inhabitants of India may live under the British, they will certainly be no better off if the British go. If we took India, the Indians would not be slow to regret the good old days of English rule.
In euren Fäusten halten müssen!
Adolf Hitler repeatedly expressed his admiration for the British Empire. Indeed, his favourite film was Lives of a Bengal Lancer.
Denn ihr seid Fleisch!
Hitler sought to persuade the British that they could keep their empire if he could be given a free hand in Europe.
Brennt dasselbe Geist, der uns beherrscht!
To their eternal credit, the British turned him down flat. Yet they only did so after 6 wasted years of appeasing him. When the Second Battle of Empires began in 1939, Britain's defences had never been so depleted. And her imperial rivals had never been so ruthless.
Das kann nicht anders sein.
The Second World War pitted the British Empire against 2 of the most evil empires in history, the German and the Japanese.
The collision between the British and Japanese empires was the collision between an old, self-doubting empire and a new and utterly ruthless one, between the setting sun and the rising sun. You might say that there were different degrees of imperialism. Certainly, in its treatment of conquered peoples, Japan's empire went far beyond anything the British had ever done. And this time, we were among the conquered peoples.
By the beginning of 1942, the British naval base at Singapore was surrounded by Japanese forces. It was supposed to be the impregnable fortress of Britain's Asian empire. But starved of resources, the defences simply crumbled on land, sea, and in the air.
Singapore, Singapore, 部隊は進撃していく.
We had been pushed back into the town itself and were being shelled from all sides. An ignominious surrender had to be made, and the fighting ceased. It was hard to believe we were now in Japanese hands. We couldn't help but think of the rape of Nanking.
将兵が夢にまで見たシンガポール要塞は
130,000 British, Australian and Indian troops laid down their arms before a force less than half that size. It was quite simply the greatest military disaster in the history of the British Empire. But the humiliation didn't end there. The Japanese High Command regarded surrender as dishonour and were contemptuous of those who did not fight to the death. The British rightly began to suspect an official policy of humiliating their prisoners of war to diminish the empire's prestige in Asia.
The British had used huge numbers of Asian coolies to build their railway network in the east. But now, in one of the great symbolic reversals of history, the Japanese forced over 60,000 British, Australian and Dutch prisoners of war to build a 250-mile railway across the Thai-Burmese border. It had been one of the British Empire's proudest boasts that Britons never, never shall be slaves. But the men who built the bridge on the River Kwai were just that. They were slaves.
The sadistic abuse of the prisoners was recorded in the secret journal kept by the Australian surgeon and POW commander, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Dunlop. Dunlop was nicknamed Weary, partly because of the stoop he had to adopt when speaking to his much shorter captors, to save their faces and avoid provoking their violent anger.
Tomorrow, 600 men are required for the railway. Light duty and no duty men and all men without boots to go, just the same. This is the next thing to murder. I see men being progressively broken into emaciated, pitiful wrecks. It is a bitter lesson to all of us not to surrender to these beasts. while there is still life in one's body.
Secretly, and at the risk of his own life, Jack Chalker, an art student before the war and now a POW in Dunlop's camp, drew vivid sketches of the conditions in which he and his comrades were kept. The punishment beatings meted out even to sick men, and the tropical ulcers that could gnaw a man's flesh to the bone. One section of railway ran directly through a massive rock face, 240 feet long and 80 feet high. The site was worked around the clock, and during the night shift, flickering carbide lamps and the gaunt faces of the POWs earned this cutting the nickname Hellfire Pass.
This really is a place of the most intense, unimaginable human suffering. What you have to remember is that Weary Dunlop and his men hacked their way through this rock, cut this pass with steel drills, digging and carrying the rock with their bare hands at the height of a cholera epidemic and during the monsoon season. And they did it in just 12 weeks. In many ways, Hellfire Pass doesn't really do it justice. In all, more than 48,000 Allied prisoners of war lost their lives in Japanese hands, roughly a quarter of all those captured during the Pacific War. Never in the history of the British Empire had there been such suffering, such sacrifice. This was the Empire's passion, its time on the cross.
After this, could the Empire ever be resurrected? True, it still had formidable resources. But the key to victory, and the key to the future of the Empire itself, lay, ironically, with the country that had first thrown off British rule.
America's hopes, America's prayers, go with the men on land and sea and air, fighting for civilization and freedom.
From his earliest days as Prime Minister, Winston Churchill had pinned his hopes on the United States. Churchill was convinced that an alliance of the English-speaking peoples was the key to victory, a victory that would restore the British Empire. When the Japanese attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, he could scarcely conceal his glee. Yet the so-called special relationship between Britain and the United States had its own special ambiguity.
To the Americans, reared in the mythology of their own fight for freedom to throw off the British yoke, the idea of ruling over subject peoples was unpalatable. It also implied those foreign entanglements the Founding Fathers had warned them against. For the Americans, it was dead simple. Sooner or later, everybody had to be like them, democratic and independent.
The Americans wanted Allied war aims to be based on the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live. That sounded like the death knell for the Empire. But what alternative did Churchill have? Without American money, the British war effort would simply have collapsed. The US advanced supplies to Britain worth billions of dollars. If the First World War ate into the Empire's savings, the Second covered the imperial balance sheet with a massive red ink. Britain now had debts of $40 billion. the British had mortgaged their empire to pay for the war. British officials negotiating with their American creditors in Washington found themselves in the position of humble supplicants. This didn't come naturally to the leading figure in the British delegation, John Maynard Keynes. In London, everyone was in awe of Keynes's great brain. He was the preeminent economist of the 20th century, and he knew it.
But when Keynes met US Treasury officials in this room here in Washington, it was a different story. To the Americans, Keynes was just one of these guys who knew all the answers, a wise guy. Keynes couldn't stand them either. He hated the way the American lawyers used to try to blind him with jargon, speaking Cherokee as he called it. And he loathed the way the American politicians used to answer the telephone when he was in mid-sentence. Above all, what Keynes objected to was the way the Americans sought to exploit Britain's financial weakness. As he vividly put it, the Americans were picking the eyes out of the British Empire.
The foundations of the empire had always been economic, but those foundations had been eaten away by the cost of the war. What's more, the new Labour government's ambitious plans for a welfare state implied a drastic reduction in Britain's overseas commitments. In a word, the empire was bust. Now, when a firm goes belly up, the obvious answer is for the creditors to take over the assets. Britain owed the US millions, and Roosevelt himself had joked about taking over the empire from its broke masters. But could the British bring themselves to sell? Could the Americans bring themselves to buy?
There was something very British about the Suez Canal military base. There were 10 lavatories at the station, 3 for officers, 3 for warrant officers and sergeants, 3 for other ranks, and 1 for the small number of servicewomen. It was a bizarre echo of the old imperial hierarchy. It was also an intimation of where the empire was headed. In the summer of 1956, the canal-based lavatories flushed for the last time as the final detachment of British troops left Egypt. Almost at once, the dynamic new Egyptian president, Colonel Nasser, nationalised the canal, which had been partly owned by the British government since the 1870s.
Now he has seized the canal itself, and Britain suffers most. For she is not only the main shareholder, but also the main user.
Convinced that Nasser was a Middle Eastern Hitler, the British Prime Minister Anthony Eden ordered an invasion. The French joined in.
Port Said reeled under the attack of Anglo-French invasion forces intent on wresting control of the Suez.
But as far as the Americans were concerned, this was just another selfish imperial adventure by the Europeans.
While ground troops mopped up isolated resistance.
With the Soviet Union trying to lure Egypt into its orbit, the Americans felt their interests would be better served by currying favour with Nasser than by propping up the British Empire. Suddenly, the old world policeman and the new were eyeball to eyeball.
We believe it can win bloodshed.
It was the British who blinked. And what made them blink was once again their economic dependence on America.
It was here at the Bank of England that the empire was effectively lost. As Britain's gold and dollar reserves drained away during the crisis, Harold Macmillan, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, was compelled to ask for massive American aid, and that meant that the Americans could dictate terms. Only when Eden agreed unconditionally to evacuate Egypt did Eisenhower come through with $1 billion bailout. The Americans had refused point blank to sanction Nasser's overthrow, and that sent a signal to nationalists throughout the empire. The hour of freedom had struck, but the hour was chosen by the Americans, not by the nationalists.
The breakup of the British Empire happened with astonishing speed. In his haste to get shot of India, the last Viceroy, Louis Mountbatten, had plunged that country into bitter intercommunal violence, which left up to 1 million people dead and countless others homeless. In Palestine too, the British had cut and run, leaving behind the unresolved question of Israel's relations with the now stateless Palestinians and the neighbouring Arabs.
Bases in the Sinai Desert.
Thus it was that the British Empire, which had literally been for sale in 1945, was broken up rather than taken over, went into liquidation rather than acquiring a new owner. It had taken 300 years or so to build, and at one time had covered around 1/4 of the world's land surface and about the same proportion of its population. It took just 3 decades to dismantle, leaving just a few scattered islands from Ascension to Tristan da Cunha by way of sad mementos.
The British had won 2 world wars, but lost their world empire. Britain's imperial wealth, based on commercial and financial supremacy in the 17th and 18th centuries and industrial supremacy in the 19th, had been exhausted by the costs of global conflict. The great movements of peoples that drove British imperial expansion changed their direction in the 1950s. Emigration gave way to immigration. The missionary impulse that sent preachers like David Livingstone around the world also dwindled.
Sir Richard Turnbull, the penultimate governor of Aden, once told Denis Healey that when the British Empire finally sank beneath the waves, it would leave behind it only 2 monuments. One was the game of association football. The other was the expression, "fuck off."
In truth, the imperial legacy has shaped the world so profoundly that we almost take it for granted. Without the British Empire, it's hard to believe that free market capitalism and parliamentary democracy would have been established successfully in so many different countries around the world. And quite apart from football, there's the English language itself, perhaps the most important single cultural export of the last 400 years. Of course, the record of the British Empire wasn't unblemished. It often failed to live up to its own rhetoric of liberty. Yet the 19th century empire pioneered the abolition of slavery. It invested in a global network of modern communications and enforced the rule of law over vast areas. Though it fought many small wars, the empire maintained a global peace unmatched before or since. It was global government that worked. And in the 20th century, when faced with the choice between appeasing or fighting the worst empires in all history, the British Empire did the right thing. In 1940, it stood alone against the truly evil imperialism of Hitler and Hirohito. The empire sacrificed itself to defeat them. Yet the breakup of British rule after 1945 hasn't meant the end of English-speaking empire. For out of the ashes of one empire, another seems to have risen.
Windows XP is the most powerful, fastest, most reliable operating system we have ever done.
Multinational corporations, Christian evangelists, and Hollywood. America's informal imperialism today isn't so very different from the monopoly trading companies, missionaries, and royal pageantry of the British Empire. Even US foreign policy recalls the gunboat diplomacy of British overseas rule in its heyday, when a little trouble in the periphery could be dealt with by a short, sharp military intervention. The only difference is that today's gunboats fly.
The recent clash between America and Islamic fundamentalism also has its parallels in the past. There's a striking resemblance between the Mahdi in the 1880s and Osama bin Laden today.
Just as in the 19th century, the opponents of empire today are cultural conservatives fighting the forces of globalization. And just as in the past, by globalization, we really mean Anglobalization, an integrated world economy under English-speaking leadership.
Yet the process of Anglobalization is profoundly different today. For one thing, the United States isn't a net exporter of capital in the way that Britain was, nor does it export millions of people. Perhaps more importantly, Americans are uncomfortable with the idea of empire. Maybe the memory of that lost war in Vietnam is still too painfully fresh.
The great poet of empire, Rudyard Kipling, put his finger on it back in 1899 when he appealed to the United States to shoulder its imperial responsibilities.
Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons in exile to serve your captives' need. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard.
Just as Kipling urged, the Americans have taken on a kind of global burden, fighting the war on terrorism, preaching the gospel of freedom. But the empire that rules the world today is an empire that dare not speak its name. The American empire is both more and less than its British predecessor. A vaster motherland, but somehow in denial about its imperial mission.
The Americans used to joke that Britain had lost an empire but failed to find a role. But perhaps the reality is that they've found a role without yet owning up to the empire. The technology of overseas rule may have changed, the dreadnoughts may have given way to F-15s. But empire is as much a reality today as it was throughout the 300 years when Britain ruled and made the modern world.